Good morning, Fairfax. So I have a question for you parents out there. And my question is, how many of you, when you were talking about the rule that your parents had that you hated, ended up having the same rule for your kids? All right, yeah, okay. So you don't. It's a rhetorical question. You don't actually have to admit to it. In the first service, I asked people to raise their hands, and I just felt like that there were a lot of people that needed to confess afterwards because they didn't raise their hands. So, all right, so we're in the final week of this series that is entitled The Gospel in the Torah. And as we've mentioned every week, and I say this every week because I know that not everyone can be here every week, and we want to just make sure everyone's on the same page, that the Torah is this one epic storyline. It's 5 books. It's also called the Pentateuch. It's 5 books, the first 5 books in the Bible that goes from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is where we're landing today. It's our last sermon in the series. And it's this epic storyline that starts with creation, and it ends with the people of God, the people of Israel, preparing to go into the promised land. And as we journey through the 5 books, the reason we called this the gospel in the Torah is because as you journey through these 5 books, you see how every story, every law, every promise, everything in the Torah is ultimately pointing to Jesus. That when you read through the Torah, you see how God's message of hope and salvation that's coming through this Messiah that is on the horizon was there right from the beginning. And as I said last week, and I just feel like we need to say it again, particularly in the global environment we're in, the political environment we're in, all of that, that the Israel of the Old Testament, the continuation of that, is not this political reality that's located on a small piece of real estate in the Middle East. That the continuation of Old Testament Israel is the church. That we are spiritual Israel. And as you read through the read through the New Testament, like that becomes really, really clear that it's those who are following Jesus who is the fulfillment of the Old Testament law, and those who have said yes to Jesus who are the continuation of Old Testament Israel. So as we read these stories, and as we talk about all of these realities that are going on, the application of that is for the church. It's for us. It's for the people of God, that we are the people of God if you are a follower of Jesus. And this week we're concluding our series by looking at the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the 5th book in the Bible. It's the last book in the Torah. And here's a little context as we kind of get into this. After their exodus from Egypt, Israel spent about 1 year at Mount Sinai, and they got the laws of God that were given to them, and they established a covenant with their God. So you had a covenant between the people of Israel and with God. And then because of their disobedience, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, they spent 40 years in the wilderness, and a whole generation of Israelites disqualified themselves from entering into the promised land. And as Deuteronomy begins, a whole new generation of Israelites are preparing to enter the promised land. And before they do, Moses delivers a series of sermons. The book of Deuteronomy is divided basically into 3 sections. The first section is this series of sermons that Moses preaches to this new generation as they're now preparing to enter into the promised land. The former generation is kind of blown it. Their parents have kind of blown it. And he's saying, okay, you are the next generation. You are a new generation. Regardless of what's going on in the past, that's really not relevant. Like, you have an opportunity to live out what God has intended for the people of God. It's one of the things I love about Deuteronomy. I love about the narrative that you read through the Torah. Is I love this focus that God has on the next generation, because I think as a church, as Kyle was talking about, we have this huge focus on the next generation. I've always said the most important generation is the next generation, and I think that we see that in the book of Deuteronomy. And as he delivers these sermons, so you have the sermons that kind of are at the first part. Second part, we'll get to that, are the laws that are given, and then the third part is kind of a where do we go from here with all of this? And so he starts with these sermons, and in these sermons, Moses does several things. One, he explains the Torah to this new generation who may not be as familiar with it, the Torah being God's law, talks about how important it is to live in obedience to the law as they prepare to possess the land, as they prepare to enter into the land that God has promised them. Secondly, he reminds them that even though the previous generation had been rebellious toward God, God still manifested his grace. That's why they were here at the river's edge getting ready to go into the promised land, is even though their parents, the past generation, had been rebellious and disobedient, now they are a new generation. Like, they don't have to be defined, love this, they don't have to be defined by their parents, they don't have to be defined by the generation that has gone before them, they don't have to be hindered by any of that. Like, this is a new day, a new generation, a new day. Whatever has gone on in the past, whatever your background is, whatever pain you have gone through, whatever family sin and generational sin is a part of your own journey, like, this is a new generation. You have a new opportunity. And as they are standing on the banks of the Jordan River preparing to go in, that's what he says to them. You have a new generation. You have a new opportunity as a new generation. And you have seen, even in the midst of the disobedience of your parents, you have seen the grace of God at work. That's why you're here. That's why you have the opportunity that is in front of you. And then third, he calls on this generation to be more faithful to the covenant that God has established with his people than the previous generation had been. And in the middle of all these sermons, there's a famous line that's called the Shema, and it's in chapter 6, and this is what it says. And when I read it, I think a lot of you are going to go, oh yeah, I've heard that, but I didn't realize maybe that it was connected to Deuteronomy. And here's what the Shema says. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." Now, you may recognize that that is the verse that Jesus quoted when he was asked by the lawyer, Jesus, of all of these commands in the Old Testament, like, what is the most important command? What is the greatest commandment? And Jesus quotes this passage in Deuteronomy 6 and says, this is the greatest commandment. Then he says the second is this, to love your neighbor as yourself. So he quotes Deuteronomy 6 and then adds the second command, which is to love the neighbor as yourself. It's a reminder that at the core, all of these laws that God gave his people are about being in a loving relationship with God and a loving relationship with others. Moses is saying, if you want to reduce all of these laws down to kind of the core, the simple core, it's about loving God. It's about being in relationship with God. It's as simple as that. It's about loving your neighbor. And the Shema became this very important prayer that the Israelites prayed daily. It's a prayer that really brings all the themes of Deuteronomy together. And at the center of the book of Deuteronomy, so you have all these messages, all these sermons at the first part, And then in the center, the second part of the book of Deuteronomy is this collection of laws which explain the exact terms of this loving covenantal relationship between God and his people. And some of the laws that we read in Deuteronomy are from Mount Sinai, and they're repeated again, but many of them are new laws. In fact, that's where this book gets its name. Deuteronomy basically means a second law. That's what the word itself means. Now, these laws, and here's sometimes where we get off track when we talk about the Old Testament, the laws of the Old Testament, because we obviously see the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus and through the eyes of Paul, and we recognize that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and we recognize, as Paul says, that he was faithful to the law, and still that was not enough to bring about transformation in his life. And so we kind of read the Old Testament laws through the lens of that, and all of that is appropriate to do, but sometimes we minimize the importance of the Old Testament laws and kind of think about them as just being God's way of trying to control people or to keep people from having fun or to regulate people in some way. And just the opposite is true. They were actually intended to help people live life to the full. The laws that God gave in the Old Testament were intended to allow people to live life abundantly, and not just individually, but as a community. There were laws about, as you read through Deuteronomy, there are laws about caring for the vulnerable and what it means to care for the vulnerable and how we should care for the vulnerable. There are laws about the protection of widows and orphans and immigrants and how important it is to protect the immigrant and to protect the widow and to protect orphans. There are laws about what it means to worship God and what worshiping God looks like and the importance of worshiping God and how we should worship the one true God. And there were laws about living a generous life and what does it mean to live a generous life and how do we live a generous life and what's the impact when we live a generous life. And there were laws about how healthy marriages look and how healthy marriages function. And there were laws about how families should relate to each other and how families should function. And there were laws about how businesses should function, how they should function in a way that they are able to accomplish their business goal and their business strategy and not take advantage of the poor. How they should be aware of the impact of the way they're living out their businesses. All of these things that are about living life to the full. And what I love too is that there were laws about how religious and political leaders were to behave. How religious, yeah, you don't have to clap, but anyway, yeah, we get it, and I agree. So, laws about how religious and political leaders were to behave. Laws that were designed so that leaders, whether it's religious leaders or governmental leaders, political leaders, would not become unaccountable, godlike figures. The nations that surrounded Israel, if you were a king, if you were a political leader, if you were in charge, you were viewed as being divine. The kings were viewed as being divine. And so there was this kind of unaccountable, divine-like prerogative that was given to the kings, and they functioned out of that, which oftentimes meant that they functioned for their best interest, but not for the best interest of the people that they were serving. And there are laws in Deuteronomy that we read, laws that are designed so that leaders would not become these kind of unaccountable, godlike figures. Laws about how they should function, how they should lead, like what good leadership looks like, what righteous leadership looks like, what just-oriented leadership looks like, all of that. For Israel, their obedience to God's laws wasn't just about following a bunch of rules and following a bunch of regulations. It was about becoming a unique people of God among the nations and showing the world the wisdom of God showing the world the justice of God. Like that was the reason there were these laws, because God wanted the people of God to show the world, to demonstrate, to live out with the world, in front of the world, to the world, to live out the justice and the wisdom of God. Like that was the focus, that was the purpose of the laws. Now, that's all kind of context. As you get to the end of Deuteronomy, so that's the messages. You have the messages of Moses that are delivered to this next generation. You have all of these laws that cover all of these different areas of political life and civil life and personal life and business life and all of that. Now you get to the end of Deuteronomy, and Moses issues this final challenge to this new generation, to this new group of folks that are living out what God has for them. And this is what he says. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. This choice. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. And then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, if you're not obedient, and if you're drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land that you're crossing the Jordan to enter and to possess. This day then, this is like the choice you have, he's saying. This day then, I call on heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. And then one of my favorite little passages in Scripture. He says, choose life. You've got this choice. I've set before you life and death. Choose life so that you and your children may live and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Moses tells Israel they have a choice. They have a decision to make. They can choose death or they can choose life. And the way that they choose life is very simple, Moses says. Like, this is the way that you choose life. It's right at the beginning of this passage. He says, you choose life by loving the Lord your God and walking in his ways. It's as simple as that. Love the Lord your God and walk in his ways. Love God and live in the yes position to God. We talk about that a lot. Like, love God, be in this vibrant, authentic relationship with God, and live in the yes position to God. In other words, life is found in being in a vibrant, passionate, authentic relationship with the living God. Now, Moses doesn't know anything yet about what's going to happen when Jesus comes. He doesn't know about Jesus of Nazareth. He doesn't know the details of that story. He doesn't know about how Jesus will come and he'll die on the cross and he'll rise from the grave. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know yet that Jesus is the one that actually makes it possible for sinful humanity to be in relationship with a holy God. He doesn't know any of the details of that story. But even without any of that specific knowledge, Moses, inspired by the Holy Spirit, Moses is proclaiming the gospel. Even in the Old Testament, Moses is proclaiming the gospel. He's proclaiming that life is found in a relationship with the living God. That it's not something that's earned. It's not something that's deserved. It is something that is received because we're in relationship with the one who gives life. That the way you receive life is by being in relationship with the one who gives life. Now, that's all, so that's verses 15 through 20. And then prior to that, just leading into that, are verses 11 through 14. that is this quirky little passage that at some level is confusing. It doesn't make sense unless you view it through the lens of verses 15 through 20, and particularly verse 16. Here's what it says in verses 11 through 14. Moses says, now, what I'm commanding you today, he's talking about the same thing. He's talking about this choice, what it means to experience life, how we experience life, choosing life rather than choosing death, all of that. Now, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven so that you have to ask, well, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it so that we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea. You don't have to go on this like heroic journey of sorts so that you have to ask, well, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so you may obey it. Now, what is he talking about? What is Moses talking about when he talks about all of this ascending into heaven and going beyond the sea stuff? What's he talking about? Well, to understand it, you have to remember that all of this immediately precedes verse 16, where Moses tells the Israelites that all they have to do to experience life is to love the Lord their God and walk in his ways. So when you look at all of this through the lens of verse 16, it all begins to make sense. Like in verse 12, he's saying, you don't have to ascend into heaven in order to experience life. Like you don't have to do extraordinary things in order to enter into the presence of God. You don't have to go up and try to reach God somehow. God has come down to reach you. Like that's what happened at Mount Sinai, and that's going to happen again. This is this God who comes down to reach us. All you have to do to experience life is to love the Lord your God and walk in his ways. You just have to love God and live in the yes position to him. And then in verse 11, he's saying the same thing. He's just using a different kind of metaphor. He says, you don't have to cross the sea in order to experience life. You don't have to do something heroic. There were all of these heroic myths that often involve the crossing of a great sea, this heroic journey in order to accomplish something that the hero was on a journey to accomplish. And what he is saying, you don't have to cross the sea in order to experience life. You don't have to go on this great heroic quest to experience life. You just have to love God and live in the yes position to him. And what's interesting is that it's this passage in Deuteronomy that's the same passage that Paul quotes in Romans 10 as he is writing to the Romans, trying to help them to understand what it means to put their faith and to experience eternal life through what Jesus has done for them. And Paul uses this passage from Deuteronomy as kind of the context to help them understand it. He says, but the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith we are proclaiming. That if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, if you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You will experience life. You will experience everything that Moses was talking about. You will experience life, abundant life, eternal life. You will experience life. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it's with your mouth that you confess and are saved. Paul is saying the same thing that Moses was saying. He's saying that salvation, eternal life, being in a right relationship with God. Lots of different ways to talk about it. But all of that is not something we have to go on this heroic quest in order to experience. We just have to love God and live in the yes position to him. We just have to confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead. It is as simple as that. And that's the thing. Like, some of you have been raised in the church, you've heard this 1,000 times, and in some respects, it loses the radical nature of it because it's so simple. And sometimes it loses even its power because it's so simple. It's just like, yeah, I know that. Like, I get that. Confess with our lips that Jesus is Lord, believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead, put our faith in Jesus Christ, and we can be saved. Yeah, so simple. But here's the deal. Sometimes it's the simplicity of the gospel that makes it hard for a person to accept. Maybe you've been on that journey in the past. Maybe you're on that journey now. It seems like something as great as the healing, transforming, restorative power of God's salvation should require us to do something extraordinary in order to experience it. We should have to go into the heights of heaven. We should have to go on some kind of heroic quest in some way just in order to experience it. And that's the paradox of the gospel. The paradox of the gospel is that on one hand, the gospel has such a low bar to entrance, such a low bar to being able to experience the life that is made available to us through what Christ has done for us. It has such a low bar that absolutely anyone, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what religious group that they were raised in or belong to, no matter what's in their past, no matter what they have done in their past, no matter how broken their past, no matter how completely and totally screwed up they are, none of that everyone can experience the fullness of God's salvation, that everyone can experience this life regardless of all of this other stuff, that there's just such a low bar to entrance. Like anyone, it's completely and totally inclusive. Anyone can experience that life. On the other hand, the gospel has such a high bar. So it has this kind of low bar right to entrance, but it has kind of this incredibly high bar because it requires you to lose your pride and to admit that you actually did absolutely nothing to deserve it. Like no act of generosity, no act of kindness, no act of selflessness on your part, no other heroic activity contributed in any way to you experiencing life, to you experiencing God's salvation. And that is incredibly hard to admit because it demands that you give up your pride. And I think it's particularly, spending most of my life pastoring in this area in Northern Virginia, I think it's particularly hard with the people that live in Northern Virginia, this driven, accomplished population that everything is about performance. Everything is about accomplishment. Everything is about, what we have done. That the idea of something so simple that you have to kind of set aside your pride and admit that you had nothing to do with is just like really hard because it demands that you give up your pride. It demands that for the rest of your life, you have to give up the right of being able to look down on anyone else in the world, including that horrible neighbor that lives next to you, or that relative that drives you crazy, or the person that claims stuff but doesn't live that stuff. Like it forever takes away your right of being able to look down on anyone. That you have to give up the right of saying, my brokenness is not as bad as your brokenness. My screwed upness is not as bad as your screwed upness. See, that's the thing. Like, all of us are willing to admit, well, we're not perfect. I understand we're not perfect. I understand I'm broken. I understand I'm screwed up at some level. I'm just not as screwed up as you. I'm just not as screwed up as this person or this person. I'm just not as broken as this person. It forever requires us to give up our right of somehow saying my brokenness is not as profound as your brokenness. And that can be really, really hard. That's why I say the gospel has such a low bar, but then there's such a high bar associated with it as well. Now, Moses says all of this, and then you get to the end of Deuteronomy. And this is what's so interesting. So he gives all these messages to this next generation about how, hey, the past generation, they didn't do so well, and they were disobedient, they were rebellious, and now you have a chance to go in a different direction, and it's so important as you go into the land that you're obedient to God, and that you say yes to him and live in obedience to him. And then he rehearses all of these laws, some from Mount Sinai, some that are new, that are really important about civil life and personal life and business life and all that. Like, this is so important that you incorporate this into your life. And then he gets to the end, and you go, in fact, as I read this, you're going to go, this is a horrible way to end a sermon. Like, I'm not talking about my sermon, I'm talking about his sermon. Like, this is a horrible way to end the sermon, because he gets to the end of all this stuff about how important it is to say yes to God, all of this. He gets to the end and he tells the Israelites, I know that after I die, you're going to rebel. I know you're going to fail, and you're going to turn away from God, and you're going to end up in exile. Let's close in prayer. Just like he goes through all of this, and just like, this is so important, this is so important, this is so important, this is so important. Do this, all of this. Here's how you'll find life. Here's what will lead to death, all of that. And then he finally says, I know you're going to fail. I know there are going to be times that you are not in the yes position to God. I know there are going to be times when you're in the no position to God. I know there are going to be times that you don't live out God's best for your life. And I know that at times that will get so bad that you will end up in exile. You will end up far away from this land that has been promised to you. It's this reminder that even the most perfectly written laws, do not empower us to live in obedience to them. See, sometimes we think, and as a culture, we tend to think this about every 4 years on November. And every 4 years, there's this event that takes place in November that we are convinced that if the right people get in power and we have just the right laws and just the right legislation and we're able to do just the right things, that everything will be good for us. And the reality is, what Moses is reminding us of is that simply is not true. Think about it. The people of Israel had the perfect laws, the best legislation. They had laws literally handed down on stone tablets by God himself, who came to the top of Mount Sinai and said, this is how you live. Like, this is what you do. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. These are the right laws to have. Like, they had the perfect laws. And still, they end up in exile. And still, they end up broken. And still, they end up far away from the place and the vision and the future that God had for them. It's because these laws that were like written here had not yet become written into their hearts. Jeremiah, the prophet who wrote while the Israelites were in exile, writes about having the laws of God written on your heart. You know, what Moses is saying here is that you've got the laws, but your heart is still broken. Like, there's something else. There's something else that is needed just beyond the right laws. Now, as you read through Deuteronomy, life, abundant life, a life filled with blessing, the good life, all of that is connected to obedience, and death is connected to disobedience. So if you obey the law, you get life, you get blessing. Do the right thing, you get blessing. Do the right thing, you get life. And if you disobey the law, you get death. If you disobey the law, you get curses. In other words, obedience is the source of your life, and disobedience is the source of your death. And then when you get to the very end of Deuteronomy, after Moses has said to the Israelites, I know there are going to be times when you're not living in the yes position of God. I know there are going to be times that you fail. I know there will be times that you fall short. I know that there are going to be times when you are not the people that God created you to be. Get to the very, very end, the last verse of chapter 13, right before he dies. And this is what Moses says to them. Hold fast to the Lord. Hold fast to him. Hold fast to the Lord. For the Lord is your life. For the Lord is your life. In other words, Moses is saying, you may think that your obedience to God is the place where you find life, but it's not. Because you're not always going to remain obedient. Sometimes you're going to fail. Sometimes you're not going to be the person that God created you to be. Sometimes you're not going to be in the yes position to God. Sometimes you're going to be in the no position to God. So your obedience to God, even though it's important, incredibly important, being in the yes position to God is incredibly important. But Moses is saying, it's not the place that you will find life. The Lord, he says, is your life. So hold fast to the Lord. Now, what does that mean? For the Lord to be your life. Well, it means that everything you do flows out of his grace. That's what it means for the Lord to be your life. Everything you do flows out of his grace. You can never get past bitterness and anger until you've received the forgiveness that Jesus offers. There's cycles of anger and bitterness in the world that drive the world, and we see it on the news every day, that will never be broken. Will never be broken unless there is the receiving of the forgiveness that Jesus offers. You can never be the husband or the wife that God intended you to be until you have experienced the security and the love that Jesus gives. You can never really live a generous life until you realize that you've been made absolutely rich in Jesus. When the Lord is your life, You stop trying to find life in other things. When the Lord is your life, you stop trying to find life in your success. Or you stop trying to find life in your accomplishments. Or you stop trying to find life in your career. Or you stop trying to find life in that one special relationship that you are looking for. You stop trying to find life in your moral performance or any kind of performance. All of those things are important, but they cannot be the place that we find life, because what happens when life gets hard, like if those are the places where we try to find life, if those are the places where you try to find life, what happens when life gets hard? What happens when we experience failure, relational failure, moral failure, failure in our vocations, vocational failure? Like if that's the place where we seek life, what happens when we fail in that pursuit? What happens when life doesn't go the way that we thought it was going to go? The way that we planned it to go, the way that we envisioned it going. Like, what happens when life doesn't go that way? What happens is we realize that our life is rooted in something that the circumstances of life can just rip away. But when the Lord is your life, when you build your life not on your accomplishments, but on what Jesus has accomplished for you on the cross. When you build your life not on your performance, but on Jesus' performance, then no matter what comes your way, no matter what life throws at you, even in the midst of your own struggles and sometimes not really living out exactly what God created you to be, still, because of His grace, we can experience life. God, I just think of two groups today as we wrap this sermon up, as we wrap this series up, that I just want to pray for. I want to pray for those who maybe have been trying to find life in something other than Jesus. And maybe it's relationships, maybe it's success, their vocation. Maybe it's even their own moral performance, their sense of like, I want to do what's right. And there is this idea that somehow if I do what's right, that I will find life. And Lord, I just would pray for anyone that falls into any of those categories, Lord, that today, as we wrap up this sermon, this series, that they would say yes to you and to the life that is only found in your life, in your grace, in your forgiveness. And Lord, I pray also for those of us that perhaps have made that decision at various points in our life, but right now are finding ourselves looking for life, trying to experience life in something other than Jesus. Like, we know Jesus is our life, but as we walk it out daily, we're kind of finding ourselves trying to fill that with other things. Lord, I pray that we would come back to you, to the one who gives us life, that we would hang on closely to you in the name of Christ. And everyone said, amen. Let's stand together as we worship.